Direction Point! Direction Point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of Doctor Who novelisations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. We are a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Mark and I'm filling in for Jason on this leg of his journey, his very long journey. It's quite an honour to host one of my favourite podcasts, so hopefully I can do justice to Jason's fantastic work so far. I've been invested with the sash of Jason, the rod of Jason, and I'm on the lookout for the elusive key of Jason. So hopefully that's a clue to which book we'll be talking about in today's episode. It is, of course, Doctor Who and the Invasion of Time. We're now talking about Target books published in the 1980s. The 80s saw me go from being an 8-month-old toddler to a fully fledged Doctor Who fan who was devouring Target books wherever I could find them. Once I'd exhausted the school and local library, I started buying them myself, and the first ones I got were the 1989 releases Dragonfire and The War Machines. Still some way off for the Doctor Who Literature podcast, but certainly The Invasion of Time was one of the books that I read as a kid, and I'm very excited to discuss that book today with my special guest. But first, over to the Doctor Who Literature News Desk. BBC Audio have announced that the next release in their audio annuals range will be The Amazing World of Doctor Who, with stories narrated from the 1976 book of the same name. The narrators are Dan Starkey, Louise Jameson and Geoffrey Beevers. The 14th series of Doctor Who began filming on Monday the 5th of December, announced with a picture of a clapperboard on the official Doctor Who Twitter feed. This was followed up by showrunner Russell T Davies' column in the new issue of the Doctor Who magazine, confirming that the next full series following the 360th anniversary specials and a Christmas 2023 episode will consist of 8 episodes and a Christmas 2024 special. He does clarify that by Christmas he means the festive period, so we'll have to wait and see if the show moves back to its traditional Christmas Day slot. I personally hope that it does. I love watching a new Doctor Who on Christmas Day. He also confirms that the Diamond logo is here to stay. It's not just for the Diamond anniversary, and in fact they only made the Diamond connection afterwards. So that is exciting. I love that logo. I'm pleased that that one is here to stay, and I think it will look great on the Disney Plus homepage outside of the UK. And perhaps most excitingly, he's announced that they are aiming to get back to a full series every year, which is obviously something we haven't had for some time. So all exciting news coming out of Bad Wolf Studios. Stay tuned, and after the break, me and my special guest will be discussing Doctor Who and the Invasion of Time.
Are you ready to travel through time with us? Then check out Traveling the Vortex, a Doctor Who podcast. For nearly 7 years and more than 500 episodes, we've traveled from one end of the vortex to the other, making different stops with different doctors, reviewing everything from TV stories to audio plays, from books to comics, and more. Sean, Keith, and Glenn take you on a journey through 50-plus years of Doctor Who episodes and spin-off materials. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, so be sure to check us out. And now, we're a proud member of Direction Point, a Doctor Who podcast network.
You're listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast.
As Leela says in The Invasion of Time, discussion is for the wise or the helpless. I'm pretty helpless, so I'm lucky that the guest we have this week is someone who is very wise to talk to about the novelisation of The Invasion of Time. Welcome to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast.
Thank you for having me on. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller.
Jason, how the devil are you, sir?
If you're looking for wise, my friend, you are looking in the wrong place.
So thank you very much, first of all, for letting me guest host one of my favorite podcasts. It's a huge honor.
You know, the first 4 episodes of this show was just me and a microphone and no guest, and I pretty quickly realized that I needed someone else's voice apart from my own, preferably more pleasing to the ear whenever possible. So I've had guests on every show, starting with episode 5, Doctor Who and the Cave Monsters. This book is so personal for me, being really my first one, that I decided I needed to be the guest for this week. So I needed a co-host, and you were my first choice.
Thank you very much. It's a huge responsibility. I do feel like I'm driving somebody else's car, but I will try to be very careful and respectful with it.
Next time you're guest host, you might want to find somebody more wise to sit on the passenger seat. But otherwise, please return the car unharmed.
So the first question I wanted to ask you, something I've been wondering for a while, and I keep forgetting to ask you. At the opening of every episode, when you say this journey, this very long journey, is that a reference to dimensions in time?
You might well think that, but I couldn't possibly comment.
So tell me, you've alluded to it there, why we're doing this sort of Freaky Friday swap with you in the guest chair and me in your driving seat. Why for Doctor Who and the Invasion of Time are we doing this?
This was my first book. This is the one that really started it all for me. I started watching the show at the behest of two of my school friends, Stephen and John, both of whom are still friends today, although they've graduated from Doctor Who fandom. They kept telling me to watch the show. And the first thing that I put on was 45 seconds in the middle of Time Flight Part 1. And I said, this is ridiculous. And I was 11 years old. I said, all right, I tried it, didn't like it, sorry. And they kept getting at me, so I turned it on the following week for what ended up being Arc of Infinity Part 2. So my PBS station is showing the show 25 minutes a night at 7 p.m., right after the home improvement show, This Old House. And it was right opposite all the kids' shows on Nickelodeon, which was one channel over on our cable box. So I was primarily watching Nickelodeon. So Arc of Infinity Part 2 is the first episode where I watched about halfway through, and the cliffhanger really jumped out at me because the Doctor appears to have been vaporized, and Nessa turns to the camera in tears. I said, wow, this is really good. Missed the next night, watched most of Arc of Infinity Part 4, which I found confusing because I didn't know anything about Omega or the Time Lords or TARDISes. I just saw Peter Davison facing himself in the streets of Amsterdam, where I had not yet been, so it probably even barely registered to me at 11 years old what Amsterdam was. And I'll tell you this, at some point in Part 4 of that story, Peter Davison as Omega is swapped out for Ian Collier as Omega. It was not until the Blu-rays came out, probably not the original. It wasn't until the original DVD came out, probably 25 years later, when the text captions go, this is Peter Davison, this is Ian Collier, when I realized it was not Peter Davison himself at the very, very, very end of the episode. So that's how young and inexperienced I was as a fan. So I enjoyed that, and it's on Monday through Friday, 7 p.m. I did not watch again for another week, so I missed all of Snake Dance, missed most of Modern Undead. The Modern Undead Part 3 cliffhanger, where he goes, 8 of them, 8 of me, this will be the end of me as a Time Lord. That's when I really started to get into the mythology of the show. Watched all of Modern Undead Part 4. Missed another week. Didn't see a single second of Terminus. And then Enlightenment Part 1, that cliffhanger, sailing ships were in space. From that moment on, I never intentionally missed an episode. That's December 1984. And to this day, I have not intentionally missed an episode ever since, even through some of the depths of the new series. So my friend John not only was watching the episodes and talking about them at school the next day, but he was also reading the books. So he brought The Invasion of Time into school one day, and I read the first few chapters at lunch. Next week, he brought in the novelization of Logopolis, and I read about most of that during a free period in class. And then finally, when I decided I wanted to get the books on my own, my parents got rid of our paid after-school babysitter and replaced her with me. And she was being paid a competitive market rate, and I was not because I was 11. So This is very bad negotiating on my part. I negotiated the rate of one book per week. That's $3 a week. That's, not even minimum wage, but that was my salary. And then if I watched my kid sister on Saturday night so my parents could go out, then I would get a third book every 2 weeks. So the very first week we did shopping, I got 3 books. And I was standing there in the Walden Books, which is, our local chain bookstore in the local mall, for like an hour. And I ended up with Doctor Who and the Cybermen, which was my introduction to Ben and Polly. Only reason I bought it is because it had Cybermen on the cover. I would have bought Logopolis had it been on the shelf that week, but it was not. I got Destiny of the Daleks because it was the only book that had Daleks on the cover. And then I got The Invasion of Time because I'd already read a chunk of it at school a month earlier, and I'd really enjoyed it. So brought them home. This is Martin Luther King Day weekend, 1985. So we buy the books on Sunday morning. Between Sunday morning and Monday night, I read all 3 books. That's about 400 pages of text. And of the 3, Invasion of Time was my favorite. I have read it over and over again since then. And when I finally met Terrence Dix in 2014 at LI Who 2, I brought 4 books for him to autograph, and I could have sworn that I had him autograph this book. So either he looked at my 4 books and only autographed 1 and wouldn't do the other 3, or this was not one of the 4 that I brought because his signature is not anywhere in here. And as I've been going through this podcast, pulling out the books, the only book out of the first year of the show that he's autographed is Terror of the Autons. So I don't even remember what I had him autograph at this point. So maybe I brought this and he said, I'm not doing 4, just doing 1. Maybe that's what happened. And he only signed Terror of the Autons. Or maybe there are 3 books later in publication order that I'll discover all the way down through the end of the line.
Great. Well, I look forward to finding out. So we have a bit of a tradition whenever I've been on this podcast with you of I'll show you mine if you show me yours. So I think this time it's snap. We both have the same Andrew Skilleter cover. My edition is, it says published in 1979, but as we know, it was actually published in February 1980. So maybe the publishers were the date that maybe they received the manuscript or something.
Yeah, it was released in 1980, but it probably went to the printers before that.
Yeah, I've got the 1982 reprint.
And I got the 1984 reprint, so it's the identical cover. It's got the identical multicolored Target bullseye logo in the lower left-hand corner. But I can tell you that I've got something that your book does not have. I have, on the title page, I wrote story code 4Z, or as you would say, 4Z.
In the same place, I think, I've got 80, which means that it was 80 pence in whichever second-hand bookshop I picked my copy up in when I was a kid, and I used to scour second-hand bookshops for Target novelizations.
Yeah, mine was purchased for $2.95 US. This is the point where Lyle Stewart, who's a crazy figure, he had a distribution company. So he had the Target books by this point, and he was charging $2.95 per, whereas in England it's only the £1.35, so more than twice as much in American dollars.
Right, yeah, that's the only difference on the back cover is you've got the Lyle Stewart and the US price, and then so the cover is obviously has a huge spoiler for the latter part of the book in the shape of Commander Storr, the Santaran, giving the Doctor some side eye.
Except, bearing in mind, I had been a fan of the show for less than 2 months when I bought and read this book. I had not yet seen any of these Santaran episodes. We got Santaran Experiment as the 3rd Tom Baker story, but those started airing in February 85. I'm reading this Super Bowl Sunday, January 85. I went through most of this book thinking that was a Varden.
Ah, right.
And when there's the big reveal at the end of the Part 4 material, this is a Santaran. I'm like, I don't know what a Santaran is. Why is this a surprise for me? I mean, I took it as it came. I enjoyed it, but it didn't have any meaning for me because I had not read or seen any Santaran stories to date during my very small, short tenure as a fan.
I suppose that's fair enough. Then that's for the casual reader. It isn't a huge spoiler for the revelations at the end of episode 4. So before we properly get into the meat of our discussion about the invasion of time, it wouldn't be the Doctor Who Literature podcast without the traditional listener limerick challenge. If you're up for playing this one.
You see, what's funny is I knew that you were going to spring some games on me as a means of torment, because I've been doing that to my guests for the better part of a year. What you didn't know is that last week, Fraser decided to one-up you by springing a game on me unannounced at the exact moment in the show when I was going to make him play 20 questions. So you're not the first person to turn the tables on me and subject me to one of my own fiendish games. But Mark, you and I were on Trap One a couple of months ago talking about the vinyl release of the Celestial Toymaker, and you tried your hand at writing limericks there for the first time, and I was very impressed. You were able to find 2 rhymes for Carmen Silvera. So when you told me that I'm playing limericks tonight, I was wondering, what rhymes with Sontaran? So I'm very curious to see what you've come up with.
Well, hopefully I can live up to that. I think we will try and find time for a game of 20 questions as well, because I'm very curious, and I'm sure your listeners are as well, what tactics you've picked up in that game from all the people that you've made play it over the last year or so.
To quote the Fourth Doctor, wouldn't you like to know? Come to think of it, wouldn't I like to know? I have a dim idea of a strategy, but I have not actually played 20 questions myself, so we'll see if I get tripped up.
Fantastic. So your first limerick. If you're looking for a new Time Lord to stan, there's one who into the wilderness ran. She's past the 7th grade, but couldn't stop the Varden raid. A glorified traffic guard called...
Rodan.
Correct.
All right, 1 for 1. It's interesting reading this book when I did. I got the impression that Rodan was going to be a very important part of Time Lord mythology in the series going forward. And, of course, she was promptly never mentioned again.
Yeah, I think you've got to think she's an influence on Romana, haven't you? I suppose particularly the first incarnation of Romana as somebody who's very cosseted in Time Lord society and isn't used to being out of the citadel, out of the capital, having adventures and having to rough it and things like that. It maybe would have been interesting had she become the companion, I suppose.
That's an interesting thought. I wonder if Graham Williams intended to bring her back for Rebos Operation for season 16, and then didn't, and ended up casting Mary Tam instead. I'm sure somebody knows the answer to that, because you're right, because you roll right from Invasion of Time into the Key to Time season, where you have a Rodan-like figure as the Doctor's unwilling companion.
Yeah, so whether they couldn't get the actor back, maybe, or but I suppose it was Hilary Ryan that played Rodan. I suppose they could have said it's Rodan, but she's regenerated as Mary Tam, I suppose. But whether there was some kind of rights issue, I suppose, about the name as well.
Well, again, who are the rights going to go to? This story is written by David Agnew, who, of course, is not a real person. He's half Graham Williams, half Anthony Reid. They are the showrunners for seasons 15 and 16. They would have had their own copyright.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. I wonder what the thought process was there.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm very happy that we have Romana, especially the Lala Ward version. I don't know if Rodan might have worked the same way. But yeah, you're right. That's a road not taken.
I suppose you've got in Romana, you've got a character who's never met the Doctor before, so you've got that initial, jumping on point for as a new season, haven't you? Whereas if it was a character who'd previously been seen, yeah, it would have been slightly different.
True, and they already had K9 Mark II as the returning companion, so I guess they wanted somebody that the audience had never seen before.
Yeah, that's true. Your second limerick. A great future for the Time Lords Rassilon could see. A president holding complete power should never be. The Chancellor keeps this relic under wraps to prevent any temporal mishaps. Along with the sash and rod, Rassilon made the great... Key. Yes, very good. 2 for 2. The Doctor's allies help him to win. Like Leela, this friend wears animal skin. He's a hairy Shebogan, strong like Hulk Hogan. The outsider leader is called...
Nesbin.
Yes.
I have to commend you for managing to work a Hulk Hogan rhyme into an episode of Doctor Who literature. That is going to be a first.
There's not too many things that rhyme with Shebogan, is there? As I realized when I painted myself into a corner.
I have had that problem writing limericks for Trap One in the past. So yes, it's you have to pick. You have to build around the end rhyme, and there are some words that just do not have natural. Like when I was doing the limerick challenge for Image of the Fendall, that was a struggle.
Yeah. So I've got one more if you're up for a last one.
Well, traditionally it's a best 2 out of 3. You're asking me to do a bonus 1-4, but again, since you're trying to turn the tables on me and subject me to my own fiendish games, I'm very happy to do a 4th.
Well, I was writing these during the quite long chase sequence through the TARDIS while I was watching it, so I had plenty of time. The Doctor is an inveterate roamer, but this week he's come home. He sends Leela to Outer Gallifrey, along with the others who don't like the new way, including an old Time Lord called...
Gomer.
Yes. I thought that was a slightly trickier one, but couldn't get it past you.
I mean, the trick with the Listener Limerick Challenge, and I've been listening to this for years on the NPR quiz show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. You have to ignore lines 3 and 4, and all that matters is the last word of line number 1, and then the rhyme in the last word of line number 2. And for Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, it's a current event news quiz every week, so it's always based on a topic that's in the news. Here, again, I'm listening to the first and second rhyme. Again, you were reaching and you were doing your best to find words that rhyme with Gomer because you're doing the rhyme backwards. And when you say is spelled E-R in England, but it's spelled U-H in America. So I'm thinking Rome, U-H. That threw me off a little bit. So I tuned out while you were doing the third and fourth lines of the rhyme just to rack my brain. And then I remembered, yes, Gomer. That's right.
I thought I'd end on a harder one, but you remain undefeated. So there's a question that I think you usually ask guests on this podcast, and that is this the definitive Terrance Dicks novelization?
For me, in a sense, it is, because it was the first Terrance Dicks that I read cover to cover. What I will say, though, is that when I read this back last year, when I got to Invasion of Time and my pilgrimage, after I read the first page, I was thinking, why did I enjoy this book at age 11? Because the first page kind of throws you in off the deep end. It's hard to figure out what's going on. And it's not Terrance's best first line, is it? The spaceship was enormous, terrifying, a long, sleek killer whale of space. And I think he misspells the word continuum somewhere in the first chapter. That's in my notes. So I think at this point I was infatuated with Doctor Who, so I was going to love whatever book came into my hands. But reading it back, it is probably not his best work. You can see where he's having a ton of fun with the political stuff. So he gets to Kellner. When I was reading this at age 11, when Kellner becomes a bad guy in the Part 4 material, I was taken by surprise. Reading it back as a grown-up, he makes it very obvious from the get-go that Kellner is the worst possible human being. Or I guess I should say the worst possible Time Lord. So he makes no mistake of hiding Kellner's villainy. And there's a great line somewhere around the Part 2 or 3 material, which took me a while to figure out. But page 51, Kellner walks into the doctor's office, and Barusa is seated behind the doctor's desk. And Terrence writes, he, quote, had ambitions in that direction himself, close quote. This confused me when I was 11 because I still had, concrete analogies. I'm like, why does he want to sit behind a desk? I didn't realize that Terrence meant he wanted to sit behind the president's desk, i.e. become president himself. That's very clever writing, and Terrence loves his politics and his backroom dealing, so that's a great line. But when I was 11, it just sailed over my head because I didn't have good abstract reasoning at that age. So not his best book, not his best prose, but it has a lot of personal meaning for me. And the political stuff, he just really, really enjoys the heck out of. So when I did my top 10 Terrence Dicks books after he passed away in 2019, I'm not even sure if that was on it.
It reminds me, talking about Kellner there, in the original treatment for this that Reed and Williams wrote, the description of Kellner says that he had all the presence of a wet newspaper. And I thought that was a terrific line. And if it was in the script, probably fed into the actor's portrayal of the character as well.
In chapter 1, he writes that Kellner is sitting at his desk, gazing off into space, quote, presumably contemplating his own importance.
Yes.
So he really clued in. So I was wrong. I had this as number 4 in my Terrence top 10 in 2019. And I had as my number 1 the Auton Invasion. So probably Auton Invasion is the definitive one because it's his first and it's his longest. So this is not the definitive, but it is close. It's close in the running for me, partly because of when I read it and where I was when I read it, and partly because he does a very good job with the Time Lord politicking and backroom dealing. This is the guy who later, remember, brought Barusa back as the villain in 5 Doctors. And I bet you it's in this, while he's at his desk writing this book, is probably when he decides that Barusa's got to be a bad guy someday. So this may have been the one that cued off that chain of events.
Yeah, you can well imagine that, can't you? I wonder why the writers decided that Time Lord Society was structured the way it was in terms of having a president, instead of, for example, a monarchy or anything like that. It's, as sort of British writers coming from, sort of a British tradition. I wonder why they went down that line instead of say a ruling family, for example. That's
a good question, because in the War Games, because Terrence, remember, co-invents the Time Lords, they didn't have a known power structure. We just had Bernard Horsfall, who comes back later on as the would-be president, and a couple of other unnamed figures. I think it was the 3 Doctors, which Terrence script edited, which brings in the word president for the first time. Now, 3 Doctors is made late 1972, right around the time of Watergate. I don't know if they were bringing that in as an allusion to the corrupt American political system. Maybe that's why they chose president instead of prime minister or king. I don't think we'll ever know the answer to that.
Yeah, it could be that sort of thing, I suppose. Yeah, because you see the Time Lords, I suppose, as more corrupt as time goes on, don't you? Or certainly like a heavy element of corruption in the society. But yeah, I hadn't thought about what you were saying there about as a newer fan picking this up. I suppose a lot of the impact of the book relies on you knowing that the Doctor is a hero, and the way he's acting for the first part. And I really like that Terrence Dicks doesn't let the audience in on the Doctor's plan until he lets Barusa in on it. So, there's no sort of tipping the wink to the audience at all, is there? So yeah, I suppose in a way, do you think some of the as your first book was some of the impact lost in terms of you not being that familiar with the character, that he didn't do this sort of subterfuge all the time, as far as you knew?
That's a good question. And again, I was just taking it as I read it, and I wasn't questioning any of the narrative choices because I was too young and I was too inexperienced or immature as a fan. I don't think I ever doubted that he was running a clever scheme and that he would eventually reveal himself as the good guy, because I knew this was a past Doctor, and here I am. At this point, I'm towards the end of the Peter Davison era. I knew that he wasn't going to be a villain for the whole piece, so I probably had blind faith in him, and I probably never questioned that this was just some clever scheme. Even Leela says it in part 2. If the Doctor wants me banished, it has to be for a reason. So if she didn't lose faith in him, there was no reason for me to. What's interesting is looking at it now, every one of the classic series Doctors gets to play a villain at some point, because William Hartnell gets to play his evil robot duplicate for parts of The Chase. Patrick Troughton is the bad guy in Enemy of the World, making him one of the best villains of the Troughton era. Pertwee in The Mind of Evil gets to do that one scene where he's mockingly laughing at the Master and being the Master's worst nightmare. Tom Baker gets this story. Peter Davison gets to be Omega for parts of Arc of Infinity. Colin Baker is the principal bad guy in The Twin Dilemma. And Sylvester McCoy is the principal bad guy in seasons 25 and 26 when he's emotionally abusing Ace in story after story after story. So now that I'm a slightly wiser fan of the show, and I say slightly, you can see that every Doctor gets to be the villain at some point. This was just this and Meglos were Tom Baker's turns.
Yeah, that's true. And in Colin Baker as well, in Mind Warp as well, I suppose, when he's it's unclear, isn't it, as to whether he's under the influence of the villains or not. But yeah. But it's nice that the Seventh Doctor and Ace made up in The Power of the Doctor. Yes,
I got to see Sophie Aldred at L.I. Who last month, and she was talking about that. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was really nice. I met her about a fortnight before you, I think, on the other side of the Atlantic. So yeah, that was really cool seeing us so soon after the broadcast of Power of the Doctor.
She had mentioned that she filmed her half of that scene on location in what's supposed to be the volcano, and there was no physical way for Sylvester McCoy at his age and in his condition to get on location. So that always had to be done by green screen. So they were not in the same room or on the same piece of location when that was filmed. But you really can't tell. They do a great job with it. That's what acting is, I suppose.
Yeah, I think she said Barnaby Edwards was there, so he read in for the Doctor. And then she got the opportunity to read in for some of the other Doctors during the Guardians of the Edge scene as well, which is it's quite nice.
That's right. She told the same story at L.I. Who. That's right.
Yeah. These anecdotes in 10, 15 years that we'll all know because we've heard so often, they're so fresh at the moment. It's really exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, in 15 years, it'll just be another eye patch or a water pistol anecdote. But for now, it's brand new and it's exciting.
So the original script for this story had the Shobogans as cat people and called for a budget-busting scene where an amphitheatre the size of Wembley Stadium was full of cat people. Jason, you're a cat person. Do you think this would have improved the finished product?
That is, and I'm going to be charitable here, and I'm going to hide my true emotions. That is probably the worst idea that I've ever heard in the long, sad history of bad ideas. You just lose every bit of credibility that the story might have when you have, first of all, how many people can you sit in Wembley Stadium? 100,000, 50,000?
This is where my lack of knowledge of any sport betrays me. I don't know. It's quite big, I think.
In 1978, there is absolutely no way they were going to be able to fill Wembley Stadium with enough people wearing ill-fitting, poorly made cat people masks. Now, Wembley Stadium currently has a seating capacity of 90,000. Although when they have U.S. football being played there, the seating capacity is diminished to 86,000. That's bigger than almost any American arena. Doctor Who in this era, you would have maybe 4 Dalek props on location, and then a mirror to make it look as if there were 8. And then you'd have a couple of dummy immobile props with no base. You can maybe get 8 or 10 Daleks or Cybermen on screen at a time. There's no possible way you're getting 80,000 people in an arena dressed in cat person masks. So now in the new series, you could probably do it with CGI and it would look painfully cheesy, like all those flying Daleks at the end of Doomsday. It's just a bad, bad, bad idea. Again, Survival is one of my least favorite classic series stories, but the cheetah masks work pretty well, all things being equal. But that's, 10, 15 years later. I don't think there's any way to make that work in this story. Just no way.
I think I hear what you're saying. They should have used real cats.
Oh God! Can you imagine if the Doctor and Barusa are trying to act a scene and there's a cat trying to bite Tom Baker's hand? Anecdote from the filming of The Godfather. This is being shot on studio. I forget where the soundstage was. Maybe Hollywood, maybe New York. I used to know this because the exteriors were shot mostly in New York. Marlon Brando picks up a stray cat in the alley behind the soundstage and brings it onto the set in Don Corleone's study. And he's petting the cat during that whole opening scene with Bonacera, the Undertaker. And the cat is purring so loud that it picked up on the audio. And they had to loop the entire scene in post-production because the cat was so loud they couldn't hear anything else. So you can barely hear the cat in the final edit. Maybe there's like one stray dubbed-in meow and Marlon Brando tosses the cat aside. Can you imagine filming in TC3 with Tom Baker and who was it? John Arnott sat across the desk with a cat in the middle nipping at them? Oh, God, that would be hilarious. It is fun when you're watching the Sylvester McCoy era. How many times does John Nathan Turner's dog show up?
Mm-hmm.
He brought his dog on location so many times; it's practically irregular in seasons 25 and 26.
That's true, and it just made me think there about the animatronic kitlings in Survival, as you were mentioning earlier.
Speaking of props that don't work.
When I watched that when I was 9, I completely didn't spot that they were not real cats. Maybe I just hadn't been around many real cats at the time. And it wasn't until I got the VHS and watched it and I saw how bad they looked. And then obviously they occasionally have the real cat when it's jumping down off a wall or something. But it did not register with me at all as a kid. I just accepted the reality as I was presented with it.
When I was 11 or 12, one of my very first Doctor Who dreams, because we got the William Hartnell package in late 1985, so I've been a fan for about a year when I would have first seen Planet of Giants airing on PBS in late 1985. That Part 1 cliffhanger with the cat, one of my favorite cliffhangers, and that was one of my first Doctor Who dreams, that I was inside a spaceship with the Doctor, and then the camera pulls back, and the spaceship was actually the inside of the cat's mouth, and the cat's head was the last thing I saw in the dream before I woke up. So that was the maybe one of the only people ever who has Doctor Who dreams inspired by Planet of Giants.
Yeah.
And that worked so well. That was made as part of Season 1. For Season 2, they brought back the feline cliffhanger. Part 2 of The Romans is the stock footage of the roaring lion. So Doctor Who has a long tradition of felines as moments of terror. Now imagine if Part 4 of this story, it has been a long, hard battle, but the future of Gallifrey is assured, and then everyone's staring over the Doctor's shoulder, and he turns around, and it's a cat meowing on the steps of the Panopticon instead of a Sontaran. There's a cliffhanger for you. The feline invasion of time.
That could only have improved it, I think. So we've probably talked about cats too much for a story that doesn't actually feature any cats. So so I think one of the things that Terrance Dicks does is to seed Leela's departure or her attachment to Andrid much earlier in the book, or at least actually Andrid's attachment to Leela probably first of all. He's very, very taken with her when they first meet, isn't he? And then when Leela and Rodan go out of the capital into the wilderness, it talks about his regret at seeing them go. So I think that probably seeds her departure a little bit better than we saw on TV. I
remember reading on the DVD production notes that Louise Jameson and Chris Tranchell worked on this in rehearsal because the departure was nowhere in the script. They had to work it out themselves. Where in the story does this scene take place? Where are the two of them at? And their silent, unspoken interest in each other. And they were working in all this nonverbal stuff that hadn't been scripted. I've been saying this. This is not the last. This is the last Leela story as text, but it's not the last Leela book to be novelized because we still have Doctor Who and the Sunmakers coming down the pipeline. Running out of chances to talk about her, and I try and bring it up whenever I can. As a performer, she does such good work thinking about Leela and thinking through the implications of a character that was designed to be eye candy and little else. So you really cannot praise her enough for what she brings to the show. So the fact that she and Chris Tranchell said, we have to make this work because otherwise no one is going to buy it. When the producer of the series who co-wrote the script and the story editor of the series who co-wrote the script couldn't be bothered to do it themselves. Was it a deal where maybe they were hoping she was going to stay and they didn't write her out because they were hoping she wouldn't leave, similar to Mel at the end of season 24? Or did they always know she was going to leave and they just did a bad job of writing her out the door? I think the answer to that is somewhere on the DVDs, but I've forgotten it.
Yeah, according to the complete history, which I've been reading today, they had hoped that they could persuade her to stay. But she was keen to leave because she was worried about typecasting. And also she still wasn't getting on that well with Tom Baker. Although, as she says in interviews now, they are, they're really great friends from their Big Finish work and I think convention appearances and things like that. But yeah, she was keen to go. And it describes how, I think once they were on location, so I guess that was the filmed parts of it. They tried to sort of build in some sort of unspoken closeness and tenderness that wasn't there in the script to help seed it as well. The part of the book where they wrestle a little bit for Leela's knife is made much more of than it is on the TV screen, where I think he just sort of holds her arm when she's wielding the knife. But that felt a bit more sort of poignant, I suppose, in the book, when they're really sort of like wrestling against each other and then sort of testing each other's strength. So I think even bits like that quite subtly build that connection between the two of them.
That's one of the great things about Terrence, because he is always thinking through the script and he's thinking through what does this mean, and he's always, people kind of miss this because the rap on Terrence is that he only ever does straight script to page transcripts. He's always, even in a short book, he's always putting in stuff that shows you his opinion of the story or to try and tie it to the continuity. So you mentioned all that about Leela and Andred, but he also, K9 tells a joke on television, and Terrence is probably shaking his head going, robots don't have a sense of humor. So he writes in the text, impossibly for an automaton, K9 told a joke. So that's pretty funny. There's another great line, which I should have mentioned earlier, about Barusa, where he's, again, thinking about Barusa being a villain. So he mentions that Barusa is acting president since the events of Deadly Assassin until a suitable president could be found. Quote, that had been some time ago, but as yet no suitable candidate had appeared, close quote. Gee, wonder why not? That just shows you that Barusa intends to stay in the role forever. And Terrence has it figured out in 1979. And it was a few more years before we get that on television. There was another part, which you didn't bring up, about Leela and Andrew, which I liked. So Leela walks out of the TARDIS for the first time, and he says that Andred is, quote, gazing at her. And then later on he says, she was so much more alive and vital than the cool remote time ladies one saw in the Capitol. So you're right, he is trying to work out this infatuation in print and make it make sense, which, again, Graham Williams and Anthony Reed certainly were not doing.
Yeah, and that helps to tie into the whole idea about the Capitol being this very sterile, artificial environment compared to the sort of untamed wilderness outside, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And what's quite nice that we're discussing this book is last time I was on, we talked about Deadly Assassin, and Terrence Dicks really ties this story into the Deadly Assassin in a way that doesn't really happen on screen. So there's some nice links and continuity to the fact that the Doctor fought the Master the last time he was on Gallifrey. So I suppose for the fans that helps it to make more sense as well.
And it's something Terrence really enjoys doing. If he is writing a sequel to a story that he was involved in, he will go in and fix the continuity errors. So when he does the novelization of Warriors of the Deep, and I think I mentioned this in last week's show, he didn't create them, but he was their godfather, because he commissioned the Sea Devils, he commissioned the Silurians. So he goes into Warriors of the Deep and puts back in all the references that help this stuff make sense. And he tells us that the lead Silurian in Warriors of the Deep is the same as the Silurian scientist from Doctor Who and the Silurians. So for here, he mentions Castellan Spandrel. And again, I hadn't read this first. I didn't even know anything about Invasion of Time when I would have first read this, but I remembered the name Spandrel. And when I finally got to the Deadly Assassin, I'm like, oh yeah, I know about this guy because Terrence talked about him. And then he explains why the Citadel looks different this time, because there was reconstruction. And he talks a lot more about what the Panopticon is. So yeah, Terrence, being a good friend of Robert Holmes and having already novelized Deadly Assassin a couple of years earlier, he's doing more work than the production team to make this a true sequel to Deadly Assassin, rather than the story that happens to take place on the same planet, but it doesn't look the same and nobody acts the same.
So having decided that they were going to set this season finale on Gallifrey, and the initial script fell through and wasn't suitable, they did approach Robert Holmes to write this, knowing that he had the skill and the experience to turn around the script in a short time frame. So again, it's kind of one of those Doctor Who what ifs, isn't it? If Robert Holmes had scripted this one, so based on their outline, how that would have turned out.
He was busy writing Sunmakers at the same time. And I am a big fan of Sunmakers. I couldn't imagine him sacrificing that to write this instead. Mm-hmm. And when they tried to get Robert Holmes to write an epic set on Gallifrey, he got about 6 sentences into the 6 Doctors and then gave up. So Terrence ended up finishing it anyway. 5 Doctors is one of the greatest stories of all time. So Robert Holmes is great, but Robert Holmes and Terrence together is even better.
Well, his contribution to this is, well, obviously he created the Sontarans and consented to the use in this, but the advice that he gave the 2 writers was that if you're doing a 6-part story, make it a 4-part and a 2-part in the way that he'd done, with those other stories, and that was how they structured the Sontarans just coming in for the 2 episodes at the end. So, yeah, his fingerprints are on this one a little bit as well.
And, of course, he had invented Barusa, so Barusa is kind of his one returning character from the original. And I think he does a pretty good job with the Sontarans, because, again, the joke in the script should be that the Vardans don't matter, they're disposable, and they're not even important. It's the Sontarans who are the real enemy. The way it's directed, the Vardans are menacing, and the Sontarans show up as comedy buffoons in episodes 5 and 6. And Tom Baker is exhibiting great mental strain as an actor when hiding from the Vardans, but he's just treating the Sontarans as a joke, and he just makes joke after joke at their expense on television. So you can see that's the part of the story where Tom Baker is just playing this for comedy and doesn't care anymore. In the book, Terrence gives the Sontarans their due. So there's a lot of jokes that Terrence makes. Sorry, I'll say that again. There's jokes that Tom Baker makes in parts 5 and 6 that are probably ad-libs because they don't appear in the book, which would have been based on the camera scripts. And since Terrence commissioned the Sontarans, again, he's their godfather, if not their creator, he puts in more about their backstory here. He uses a similar line, I think, to Time Warrior, where Sontarans only smile at the death throes of an enemy, makes reference to the Time Warrior, makes reference to the Sontaran experiment. And then he has this great line. The Doctor observes, how like the Sontarans to use an entire species for their shock troops and sacrifice them without a second thought in the cause of Sontaran victory. So arguably, Terrence does a much better job with the real bad guys of the story than happened on television.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that builds into not only will sacrifice the Vardans as their shock troops, but will sacrifice a large number of Sontarans as well to bring about the destruction of the Time Lords. So it's I think that's made more of in the book than in the TV serial, and makes it a threat that sort of justifies, I think, maybe the Doctor carrying a big gun or having a big gun constructed and then gunning down, which is an unusual resolution for the Doctor. But then I was sort of thinking about it a little bit today, and if it hadn't been a gun, if it just built some other kind of device that was there to defeat them, it would have been a much more conventional Doctor Who ending. But the fact that it's shaped like a gun slightly makes it a little bit uncomfortable, maybe.
But then you have to wonder if this is not an influence on Stephen Moffat, because when he comes in and does his big Time Lord epic, Day of the Doctor, which, by the way, I think is tremendously overrated, he has a huge forgotten Time Lord weapon out of the vault show up as the key to solving that story. And there the Doctor, kind of suppresses his memory of what happened. And here the Doctor has amnesia after using the key, after using the DMAC gun, and forgets everything that happened. So you have to wonder if this was not a big influence on young Stephen Moffat, because he's kind of taking the story's concepts and resolution and recycling it into Day of the Doctor, 35 odd years later. Something else I want to say here before we segue into 20 questions. I'm not letting you off the hook with that one. I want to see how I do. This is Terrence's longest book in 3 years, because before this, he was doing, those 100-page books in 1979. This one clocks in at 136 pages, starts on page 7, ends on page 142. That's his longest book since the 1977 books, when he was doing 140-pager after another. So he could have easily made this a 120-page trifle like Planet of the Daleks, which is a very short book for a 6-part story. He really must have enjoyed this to make it as long as his novelizations of Dalek Invasion of Earth or Talons of Wang Chiang, which are 2 very highly regarded 6-part stories. And even with that, Part 6 is rushed. Part 6 is only 21 pages. This could have been even longer, but he was right up against the word count in getting this under the wire.
Yeah, and I think if he described the full chase through the TARDIS, it would have become as tiresome in print as it does on the screen a little bit as well. I love
that chase through the TARDIS. I love the idea that the TARDIS had an art gallery and a swimming pool. And when I'm reading this, Super Bowl Sunday 1985, I was drinking this stuff up. So when I finally saw it on television, the interiors of the TARDIS, as done in the disused hospital, didn't match what I had in my head. And even when I saw it at age 12, I would have been slightly disappointed. But I think it's a great idea. And even then, Stephen Moffat, again, he does a whole episode called Journey to the Center of the TARDIS. And it's one of the worst things ever commissioned by Stephen Moffat. But again, it's an effort to do Invasion of Time all over again. To a lesser extent, also, the second half of The Doctor's Wife is a chase through the TARDIS. So, again, you have to wonder if Neil Gaiman wasn't consciously harking back to this particular story. And everyone loves The Doctor's Wife in a way that nobody loves Journey to the Center of the TARDIS.
Yeah, I think just to finish off there, what I was thinking about with the Doctor sort of wielding a gun, maybe the idea is, the Doctor hates guns, he never wants to pick up a gun, but it's to emphasize the threat that Sontaran's taking over Gallifrey and then being able to go through all of time and space and conquer everything, in the way that in The End of Time, it's a big moment when the Doctor picks up Wilf's service revolver, having always eschewed guns, that when he knows the Time Lords and Rassilon are coming back. So maybe it's not quite delivered in the same way, but I kind of wondered if that's what they were going for, that, the Doctor picking up a gun when, he's constantly been telling Leela, throughout their journeys together, I hate guns, don't use guns, whether there was something in that.
So I am, I'm 25 years out of law school. So anytime you say something, my brain is always looking for exceptions or counterexamples. So I'm going to do that right now. I can think of 2 counterpoints to the Doctor doesn't use guns. Number one, Terrence commissioned Day of the Daleks. Terrence script edits Day of the Daleks. Terrence novelizes Day of the Daleks. He has John Pertwee blasting Ogrons with a disintegrator gun. So in Terrence's headcanon, even though he famously writes the Doctor is never cruel or cowardly, he never had a problem with the Doctor shooting things. Same with the end of Monster of Peladon, where firing another dematerialization gun takes care of the Ice Warriors. Terrence didn't write that, but he did script edit it, and then he novelizes it shortly after this one. Second point is that Terrence co-writes the War Games. How do the Time Lords get rid of Philip Madox's character in the War Games? They quote-unquote dematerialize him. So by Terrence looking at the demat gun here, I bet you in his head he's connecting it up with the War Games. This is how the Time Lords dispose of a threat. They dematerialize it and make it that it never existed. So even if it wasn't consciously intended by Terrence, I think it fits into his headcanon because the very first thing that he has his name on a Doctor Who script features the Time Lords dematerializing the bad guy in the last episode. And it happens again here in a book that he doesn't write the TV story, but he does novelize. So maybe for Terrence, this is just another day at the office.
True. But very well argued, as always.
You may be seated.
No further questions. So, on that note, are you ready for your first game of 20 questions as the contestant?
I am very excited. I will say that nobody has ever failed at this game, but there is an asterisk. I won't say who and I won't say when, but if you've been listening to the show week in and week out, and if you haven't, why not? But if you've been listening to the show week in and week out, there was one guest who nearly failed, and I had to pretty much put a foot on the scale to make them come in at under 20 questions. I am wondering if I will have the same fate. So I'll point out that we have not discussed this in advance. I have no idea which story you picked. And I have no idea if it's going to be classic or new series. I will have to figure it out myself.
I've just generated it this second so that there was no way that I could accidentally mention it in conversation or or allude to it because it was in my mind or anything like that. So I think I'm right in saying that Conrad still holds the record at 6 questions. Is that correct?
Conrad got it in 6. He dethroned Simon Hart. Dale Smith almost got it in 5, but just short of Conrad's mark. I think Conrad's mark is safe for all time, except that you had that very clever idea of playing the opener. You played like Wordle style. You took one random story, and that was your first question, and you're going to ask it every time, and eventually that'll be the answer.
Yeah. Well, that's it. If I can get it on the first go, I'll be unbeatable for all time. So that's my tactics. So yeah, I'm very, very interested now to see what your tactics are.
All right. Well, I am going to take a page out of your book, and I am going to pick one Doctor Who story at random, and I'll ask that first. And if that isn't it, I will then proceed with the rest of the 19 questions. I probably won't beat Conrad, but why would I want to beat Conrad? I'm very happy to have Conrad as the all-time record holder. Hi, Conrad. So I'm not trying to beat you. And if I do, it's not on purpose. All right, so the random story that I have been picked is, oh man, is it Heaven Sent?
It is not Heaven Sent.
All right, Conrad, you're safe. Second question, is it the classic series?
It is the classic series.
Is it from the 1960s? Question 3.
No.
Is it from the 1970s? Question 4.
No.
All right, so now I know that it's from the 1980s. Now I'm at question 5. The problem is that there are 4 doctors in the 1980s, and I might spend 4 questions narrowing that down. So instead, I'll do it this way. Was Eric Sayward the script editor? That should be question 5, I think.
No, he was not.
All right, so that means it's either Bidmead or Cartmel. Question 6. Is it Bidmead? Is Bidmead the script editor?
No.
Is Cartmel the script editor? And I asked that for a very clever reason. Is Andrew Cartmel the script editor?
Yes.
Okay, so that narrows it down to one of the last 11 stories, because he was the run from Paradise Towers through Survival. Was Ace in the story?
No.
All right, now there's only 3 choices, because there's only 2 choices. Is it Paradise Towers?
No.
Is it Delta and the Bannermen?
Yes.
All right, so what's that? Is that 11 questions? I lost track there.
That's 9 questions. That's a very respectable.
That's respectable. That's respectable. I got it in 9. Not as good as Conrad, not as good as Simon, not as good as Dale Smith. That's a pretty decent showing. And if I hadn't gone for the opener, I would have had it an 8.
Yeah. That's true. But yeah, if it had paid off, it would have. That's the gamble, isn't it? That's the game.
And I'm a big fan of Delta and the Bannermen, so I'm proud to have that as my story.
That's my least favorite of season 24, and just I
really
can't love that one. Much as I'm a massive McCoy fan, and that's where I came in. Yeah, Delta the Bannermen just probably my least favorite story for him.
I will have more to say about that when it comes up on the show in sequence. But Delta, I came through the novelization first, and I loved the novelization. And then when I saw it on TV, I thought the production was really bad, and I didn't enjoy it as much. But having seen it now on the DVD and the Blu-ray, knowing that, see, I grew up, my parents were like the last generation for whom Broadway shows were like the vernacular in pop culture. So growing up in the late 70s, they were always playing classic Broadway show cassettes on car rides. So I heard the Guys and Dolls soundtrack over and over again. So I knew all about Stubby K. And all of a sudden, I'm watching Delta and the Bannermen, and there's Stubby K in a Doctor Who episode wearing a Yankees cap. I was very excited. That's another reason for me to like that story.
So it almost seems redundant to ask, given that it's your podcast, but where can our listeners find you?
See, when I am the host, I always give my credits at the end of the show. Since you're going to be the host this time, you'll be giving your credits. So I'll just say you can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels. That's at Dr. Who Novels. You can find my reviews of the entire series under the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage. That's Dr. Who Pilgrimage. You can email the pod at Doctor Who Literature. That's drwholiterature@gmail. I love getting emails. Please send me one. And you can find all episodes of the show at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. And that's Dr. DOCTOR. Wholit.
And which book is next week?
Next week is going to be book number 55. So Invasion of Time is book 54 in publication order. That was the February 1980 release. After this, we are going to be in a long cycle of the Key to Time. So next week is going to be The Stones of Blood, the March 1980 book. And after that, Terrence did 4 books in 4 months, doing the end of the Key to Time season in consecutive order. So it's 4 books coming out in direct broadcast order, one after another. So for a month after this, I've got my guests lined up. We have the last 4 Key to Times, all novelized by Terrence Dix in rapid fire mode. These are going to be short books. And 3 of them are excellent and 1 of them is not. I'll leave it for you, the listener, to decide which of those 4 books I don't think is very good.
Fantastic. Well, I can't wait to hear those episodes. Thank you very much for joining me. And hopefully we'll talk about another book again soon.
The one thing that I've learned sitting here in the guest chair, it is much harder being a guest on this show than it is being the host. I'm trying to figure out, how much do I talk? Do I let you do the talking? Do I talk as much as possible? It's challenging. I know for a fact that I have not been the best guest on this show. I can tell you that much.
Well, you've been the best guest while I've been hosting it.
That's true. And I'm taking the reins of the show back next week. So I may have you guest host again, but sorry to disappoint everyone who's here for Mark. I will be back to being the host of the show for episode 55, Doctor Who and the Stones of Blood.
I think I can hear the sigh of relief there. So
maybe I should put up a snap poll on Twitter. Who's the better host of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast, Jason or Mark?
I'll be handing back the keys and filling up the tank. So it should be all yours from next week again.
And I should probably, as long as we're making jokes about the blank of Rassilon, I should probably say at this point, get your hands off my rod. ... of Rassilon.
Doctor Who and the Invasion of Time, written by Terrance Dicks, televised as The Invasion of Time, teleplay by David Agnew, broadcast February and March 1978, book published in February 1980. A traitor to the Time Lords? Can the Doctor really be in league with the evil Vardans, spearheading a treacherous invasion of his home planet Gallifrey? Or is he playing a deadly double game, saving the Time Lords by appearing to betray them? But the Vardans themselves are only pawns in the game, and the Doctor faces an old and deadly enemy as he battles to foil the invasion of time. Between the picture of Commander Storr giving the Doctor some side-eye on the cover and the back cover blurb, Terrance Dicks almost need not have bothered carefully maintaining the mystery over the Doctor's apparently nefarious actions for so long in the book. The novelisation shows what a strong story this is, and on television only really let down by production constraints. A season finale where the Doctor seems to facilitate an invasion of Gallifrey, just as the Master has so many times allied himself with aliens to try to invade the Earth, should really stand out. The Doctor rarely initiates anything. He turns up at random or tries to go on holiday or visit an old friend. We won't see this kind of proactive planning to defeat an alien menace again until the 7th Doctor's era. But most people think of the tinfoil effect for the Vardans or the hasty departure of Leela, not the excitement of seeing Gallifrey invaded, or some genuine twists that are pulled off very effectively the first time you watch or read this story. There are some nice things on the TV story that don't make it into the book, which makes one think they were probably improvised on the day by the cast and aren't in the scripts that Terrance Dicks was presumably working from. At the beginning of the story, the Doctor pockets the pen that he uses to sign the contract with the Vardans. It's not mentioned in the book. If you're watching the modern series, you'd almost expect that to be something he later uses against the invaders. When they're wandering around the TARDIS later in the story, the Doctor says he knows the ship like the back of his hand, and as he looks at the palm of his hand, Leela patiently turns it over for him. In the books, it says he just looks thoughtfully at the back of his hand. Terrance Dicks' description of the Vardans makes me think of some technology that we're now very familiar with in the modern interpretation of Doctor Who. The strange thing about the Vardans was that they weren't quite there. It was as if they existed in some other dimension, some other reality. The astonished High Council saw 3 tall, shimmering shapes, cloaked and hooded figures with the vaguest hint of features under the hoods. But somehow it was impossible to get a really good look at the Vardans. Something about them turned away the eyes. I think it's entirely possible that this description seeped its way into Russell T Davies's imagination for the perception filter device that he introduces in Doctor Who in the 21st century. Pick that idea that your attention is turned away from something and you can't quite look at it. I suppose, to some extent, Stephen Moffat idea, there's various things that you can only see out the corner of your eye as well. Gallifrey itself is much more impressive in the book. The Grand Hall of the Panopticon is an immense circular chamber used by the Time Lords for all their major ceremonies. It is one of the largest and most impressive chambers in the known universe. The immense marble floor is big enough to hold an army. The domed glass roof seems as high above as the sky itself. Row upon row of viewing galleries run around the walls, and on the far side of the hall, an impressive staircase leads down to a raised circular dais. By now the hall was filled with rank upon rank of Time Lords, all wearing the different coloured robes and insignia of the different chapters, the complex social, family and political organisations that dominated Time Lord society. So obviously this is much more impressive than the room that we see, and really fires the imagination. And it's also a way in which Terrance Dicks ties into The Deadly Assassin, which the book does much more than the TV show, as we touched on with the discussion with Jason. And the idea that there's the Pridonian chapter and the different chapters, don't think is mentioned on the TV story, but is alluded to there. And while we're talking about Gallifrey, the book also says, the capital was so large that it covered most of Gallifrey. Indeed, to a Time Lord, the capital was Gallifrey. The country outside was still surprisingly wild and primitive. And this made me think about Susan in the Sensorites when she says, the sky is a burnt orange, and leaves on the trees are bright silver. So she must have had an atypical childhood for a Gallifreyan. But you can imagine, I think, the Doctor having snuck out to see the hermit on the mountain in his childhood, or perhaps having spent some of his childhood in the barn that we see in Day of the Doctor and Listen, that he would have wanted to share some of that experience of nature with Susan, away from the sterile, artificial environment of the capital. And that's what stuck in her mind, the sky of burnt orange and the leaves, which you wouldn't necessarily get to see from the windowless rooms that we see in this story. Of course, in the 21st Century series, we've seen the capital from the outside, and we see that it is a now familiar domed city, which is surrounded by rugged countryside and doesn't appear to take up most of Gallifrey in the way that it's described here. Reed and Williams' story outline for this one describes Gallifrey as an Earth-normal planet aided by Time Lord technology. The population is fed and clothed synthetically, and they exist in an Arcadian paradise. Arcadian, I suppose, here meaning sort of rustic simplicity and kind of bucolic, quiet pleasure. So perhaps this is where Stephen Moffat lifted the name of Gallifrey's second city, Arcadia, from, for the Day of the Doctor, which is much less, I suppose, built up than the capital and less domey. Another scene in the book which I'm very keen on is Terrance Dicks' description of K9 moving through the capital. So on screen, this is just K9, his motors very noisily whirring away as he moves along a corridor. But in Terrance Dicks' hands, it's somewhat more poetic. K9 glided through the corridors of the capital like some great metal rat, keeping close to the walls, hiding in quiet corners behind statues and tapestries, lurking in patches of shadow. Several times he narrowly escaped being seen by patrols of guards, and once 3 shimmering alien shapes glided along a nearby corridor, making K9's antennae bristle with their alien presence. So I really like that. Obviously on screen, K9 isn't anywhere near as agile and nimble to be hiding behind things or lurking in shadows, but it's a very, very nice way of describing K9 making his way through the capital, I think. The novelisation doesn't mention the big curly straw which Barusa is drinking his cocktail from when he's lounging by the pool in the TARDIS. So my headcanon is still that this is standard issue Time Lord straws, like the one that the 11th Doctor has in The Impossible Astronaut, which he says adds extra fizz to his drinks. And as Jason picked up on Terrance Dicks describing K9 making a joke as impossible as possibly a comment on the script, I do wonder if the final act of the story as well. In the same moment, the Doctor raised the DMAC gun and fired. Store vanished, and the exploding grenade vanished too. Somehow, the energies released by the atomic grenade and the DMAC gun blended, merged, and cancelled each other out. So that also sounds like it's very sort of light on what's actually happened there. It reminds me of the somehow Palpatine has returned meme, that goes around from, I think, the underrated Rise of Skywalker. But yeah, so just somehow this happened. Everything cancelled each other out. The weapon, the all-powerful DMAC gun, had disappeared, and everything's resolved very quickly there. So that is Doctor Who literature on Doctor Who and the Invasion of Time. Thank you very much for joining us. You'll be very relieved to hear that normal service will be resumed next week, when Jason will be back in the host chair. In the meantime, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Quark McMalus. And you can find me on the Trap One podcast, which Jason and I are among the co-hosts of. And if you have enjoyed hearing me and Jason discuss a book, in the next couple of weeks you can hear us on Trap One, where we'll be talking about Doctor Who Origin Stories, which is an anthology of short stories about some of the companions and friends of the Doctor from earlier in their lives, before they started travelling with the Doctor. And that boasts contributions from Sophie Aldred and Katie Manning as well. So very excited to discuss that one. You can find the Trap One podcast wherever you get your podcasts, or at trap1.podbean.com. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Good night now.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.